Hi everybody, my name is Pastor Quinton and welcome to session 1 of our series Understanding Galatians. Today we're looking at the topic of the authority from God versus the approval by man. What we hope to do is be able to kind of look at a key verse and then to unpack that key verse in light of a passage that we give you. The hope that this series would be a series where you can get into the Word, you can read the Word, study the Word, unpack it, and see what it really means and apply it to your life. And so we're hoping that in your home groups you'll be able to read through the whole of Galatians and get a really good understanding of it and see really how that can be really practical for your own personal lives as well. One of the things we are trying to do this series is look at the three C's as a broad framework to understand Scripture. The first one's context, and then we're going to look at content, and we're going to look at what it means to consider what God is speaking to us through the Scripture as well. So we'll kind of delve into that today in our session together as well. But Galatians, if I could kind of kick off, is a letter in the Bible. And with any letters and any books in the Bible, you really need to kind of understand the context behind it. So who wrote the book, and who's he writing to, and what is he writing to them about, is some of the questions we need to ask ourselves. In Galatians 1, it's very clear in verse 1 and 2 that he's actually writing, Paul is the writer, and he's actually writing to the church in Galatia. Now, you've never heard about Paul before, if you read briefly about Paul, he's actually a very significant player in the New Testament. It is worth your while to check out and research him a little bit more. At the same time, the church in Galatia, who was the church in Galatia? We find that out a little bit more in Acts 13 and 14, because it talks about Paul's missionary journeys, and it talks about how he started out in this region, and many were saved, many were healed, and the churches in Galatia are saved. And so we see that there is this connection here with Paul and the churches in Galatia, because Paul was there before. Paul was connected with them. In fact, later on in Galatians, we see he talks about his love for them, and it's almost like this father's love for them, where he cares a lot. That's why he's saying the things that he's saying. But why is he writing to them? Every letter has a purpose behind it. And so we really need to unravel why Paul's even writing to the churches in Galatia to begin with. I think in verse 6 we're given a clue as to why that's happening. So let's read that together. He says, I am astonished, he uses really strong words here, that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. What we're hearing is that what's happening is that in the churches of Galatia, there is a movement to move away from the teachings that Paul originally gave them. He's saying that Paul came to preach the gospel, that Christ alone was enough, but now something else is happening. They're starting to believe something else. That there's actually in verse 7 it says that there are actually some people coming into this place and trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. So what's really happening here? What's really happening in the churches of Galatia? Let's backtrack a little bit. When the early church happened, the Christians were really a Jewish messianic movement. And they started out in Jerusalem with the Jews, and eventually it moved out to all mankind. That was always God's purpose, that Christ came for everybody, not just for one race, not for one person, but for everyone. And so by Paul's time, what we're seeing is that there are Jews and non-Jews, which are Gentiles, that are now Christian. There are all sorts of different people who follow Christ. And it leads then to this time in Acts 15, where this big argument happens, this big debate happens around what it means to actually be a Christian. And on one side of the fence, you had some of these Jewish Christians that were saying that who grew up under the principles and laws of the Torah, where you had to be circumcised, where you had to eat certain types of food, where the Sabbath had to be upheld. And they were the ones saying that, hey, look, Christ is good, but we need all these other things to follow in order to be part of the family of Christ. And they were saying that Christ alone by itself wasn't quite enough. You needed all these things added to it to make sure that you are part of Christ. And that was what was happening basically. These Jews were coming into the churches of Galatia trying to preach a different gospel. And often scholars would call this group of people, they were called the Judaizers, where they were influential, because obviously Paul had to write this letter to address this issue here. So what's really Paul trying to talk about? What's Paul really trying to write, and what's Paul trying to get across to us as readers? Let's look at the content of what he's saying. Verse 6, as I mentioned, really sets it up that Paul is really trying to defend the gospel. He's really trying to defend the authenticity that the gospel is that he preaches is the only gospel. He uses such strong words in this chapter that leave you with no question at all of what he feels about anything that's added to the gospel. Anything that's added to the gospel, anything else other than what he preaches of Christ alone, it's nothing. In fact, he goes as far as saying in this chapter that anyone who tries to preach anything other than the gospel I preach, let them be cursed. And so he sets it up in such a way that he wants them to know that the gospel is all that you ever need. The gospel is what you need to cling to. But how does he prove that? How does he bring them back to the place where he wants them to that they know the gospel is from Christ? He starts to draw out his argument. He starts to draw out his argument through the rest of chapter 1 in verses 11 onwards, where he starts to address the issue of where the gospel comes from and how he got the gospel. If you're trying to read through those verses, you'll understand that he got the gospel through the authority of Christ. He talks about how he himself went from pleasing man and doing all the things that these Judaizers were doing to having the revelation that Christ is all that he needed. And that was the gospel he was trying to preach. Paul talks about how the gospel in itself is complete. There is nothing else as Christians that you should be adding to, because Christ brings you into the family of God through what Christ has done. The Judaizers were not doing that. They were adding to it. And Paul says that anything else that you add to it is just not God's gospel anymore. It actually is nothing. It amounts to nothing. There is no such gospel. There's no in-between ground here. It's either you believe in the gospel of Christ or there is no gospel. In fact, in our key verse there, which is Galatians 1 verse 10, I think he sums it up quite well. He starts out by saying, For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? Then this is the key part. If I was still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. What he's saying here is that if I try to preach, if I try to please anything other than God, if I try to add anything on and to the gospel and believe that's pleasing man, you can't please God at the same time as please man. It's one or the other. Paul's trying to say to us that, if you were to really try to please God, the gospel of Jesus Christ alone is enough, is what we cling to. As we consider this passage, as we consider in our lives what this means for us, think about, ask yourself the question of, am I a man pleaser? Am I a God pleaser? Ask yourself questions about how this view, your view on Christ, the view on God, is challenged and changed as a result of this scripture. Ask yourself, am I sometimes like these Judaizers who add stuff to my own faith and elevate things that I shouldn't in my life just to please man? What is it? As you reflect on scripture today, as you in your discussion groups, I pray that you have a great discussion. God bless.